Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Price of Glory, Verdun, 1916, by Alistair Horne, narrated by John Lee. Preface. In November of this year, 1993, 3/4 of a century will have passed since the armistice of November 1918 brought to a close the war to end all wars, while it is now exactly 30 years since The Price of Glory was first published. Miraculously, it has remained in print ever since. It was written in a time of relative peace and prosperity. The Korean War had ended 10 years previously. In the "You've Never Had It So Good" years, Harold Macmillan and John F. Kennedy were at the helm. In Europe, de Gaulle and Adenauer had clasped hands on a new entente between the French and the Germans, marking an end to that old murderous rivalry. The thought of another European war seemed to belong to a distant age of darkness and folly. At about the same time, several of us British writers, in our 30s, who had grown up or served in World War II, wrote books about that first conflict. In our latter-day superiority, we chastised our foolish ancestors for letting it all happen, almost by mistake as it were, and letting it happen that way. They were donkeys. In our enlightened world, the Somme and Verdun could never be repeated, said Scott Fitzgerald's Dick Diver, stricken by a visit to Verdun a few years after the battle. If there ever had to be war again, then World War II, with its tanks and aircraft and blitzkriegs, showed that there were better ways of waging it than by hurling tens of thousands of men to certain death across the mud of no man's land. Our generation knew better. Through the finely tuned balance of terror between the two superpowers that later became known as MAD, mutually assured destruction, and was perhaps not so mad after all, the Verduns and Sommes continued unthinkable. Perhaps in our self-satisfaction, we chose to suppress the unpalatable truth that World War II had not really been won by tanks and aircraft, but by the Verduns, fought out of sight of our western eyes in the east, at Stalingrad and before Leningrad, where hundreds of thousands of Soviet and German infantrymen had died in appalling battles of attrition, just as they had a quarter of a century previously. The reality is that between two equally powerful modern industrial states, total war costs lives. From the recent release of records in Havana and Moscow, we now discover that during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, the very month that The Price of Glory was first published, the world had actually come closer to a nuclear Götterdämmerung than we, or even our enlightened leaders, had ever understood at the time. The deaths from which would have made Verdun look like a little local skirmish. Since then, apart from a series of quick but indecisive wars in the Middle East, we have had the prolonged nightmare of Vietnam, so demoralizing to a generation of Americans, and with it the attendant horrors of Pol Pot's Cambodia, a Holocaust every bit as bloodily evil as anything seen at Verdun. We have seen the 7-year-long war of attrition between Iraq and Iran, with its static battles that were miniatures of the Western Front. And then, barely was the Cold War won than, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with the disappearance of MAD, there was war, murderously vicious, in Europe once again, in those very same Balkan provinces of old Austro-Hungary, where the ineluctable descent to Verdun had all begun in 1914. Have we learned anything? The genesis of The Price of Glory dates back to the 1950s, when, as a young foreign correspondent in Germany, I lived amid the visible legacy of that last bout of Franco-German hostility, which was then still all too tangible. Now that relations between France and Germany, the root of evil in the world I had grown up in, had already taken such a miraculous turn, I began thinking of a book. It ended as a trilogy, which might trace the lethal course of these relations over the preceding century. A first visit to the sinister hills of Verdun engendered emotions that were never quite to leave me alone. Fascinated by the story and its profound historic consequences, admiring of the staggering courage of those on both sides who fought there, but appalled by the waste and sheer stupidity. No other book I have ever written affected me quite so deeply. The tears came again and again. It was, unashamedly, an anti-war book. Over the past 30 years, gratifyingly, the letters have flowed in from all over the world, Perhaps most, curiously enough, from the United States, with the powerful reactions of readers to the battlefield, old photographs, the reminiscences of survivors and descendants, and sometimes deeply moving verses. Earlier, there were the ghosts, the reappearance of those long-assumed dead, like Lieutenant Eugen Rathke, the first German officer into impregnable Fort Douaumont, making, in the 1960s, his first appearance in Paris from East Germany, the only time in his 70 years that he had travelled further west than Douaumont. He died shortly afterwards. Surprisingly, in all the volume of correspondence, little caused me to want to change more than a line or two in successive editions. There was the elderly Frenchman, ex-Lieutenant Kléber Dupuy, a hero of both wars, and very probably the last officer to stand in the way of the final German last-gasp effort to take Verdun atop Fort Souville on the 12th of July 1916. He complained that, in the not very immaculate French translation, I had suggested that he had taken refuge within the fort. Unhesitatingly, I altered the record. We became firm pen pals. Otherwise there was virtually nothing. The record seemed to stand on its own. At Verdun today, one of the forts, Troyon, had been sold off for a mere 100,000 francs as a mushroom farm. The sad little plaque on Fort Vaux, once placed there by an unknown French mother, "To my son, since your eyes were closed, mine have never ceased to cry," has disappeared, vandalized. The pine forests that were once planted to hide, mercifully, the tormented soil of the Mort d'Homme have now been felled and replanted. But the hard core of Verdun will, one feels, survive as long as the French nation itself. In the wilderness, battered and crumbling, there still lie concealed, like Shelley's Ozymandias, half-forgotten monuments to the folly, pride, and heroism that epitomized what we still call the Great War. They continue to take their toll at regular intervals, from the foolhardy tourist, rashly questing for trophies or the ruins of deserted forts, and stumbling up against a still lethal shell. The busloads of Germans continue to flow up to Fort Douaumont, seeking the place where a grandfather or great-grandfather fell. In the half-dozen or more times that I have been there since writing The Price of Glory, I never failed to be haunted by the majesty of the place, and the sadness. In 1966, at the sombre 50th anniversary commemorations, I found myself within a few feet of General de Gaulle. Erect as a ramrod, he stood until the lengthy Son et Lumière presentation reached the date when he, de Gaulle, had fallen wounded in the battle and had been captured. Then he turned on his heel and left. Perhaps it was too much to bear, even for that icy Titan. Nearly 2 decades later it was also to Verdun that de Gaulle's successor, François Mitterrand, came solemnly to seal the end of Franco-German enmity by shaking hands with Chancellor Kohl on that savage battlefield. When I was last there, lecturing to a battalion of Grenadier Guards, the young officers were reduced in short order to respectful silence by the tragedy of the place, for all its distance in history. One remarked to me, "Do you know, there are no birds here." Until that moment, I had thought that I was the only person to have experienced that peculiar sense of utter desolation. One of the most dread aspects of Verdun was how, after the first 3 months, the battle seemed somehow to have rid itself of all human direction and to have taken over. One German thought there could be no end to it until the last German and the last French hobbled out of the trenches on crutches to exterminate each other with pocket-knives. Strangely, Scott Fitzgerald called Verdun a love battle. Between the simple, slaughtered infantrymen on opposing sides, there was indeed a special kind of compassion, almost amounting to love. But there was too much hatred at the top, which kept the battle going. For 1916 would, in a rational world, have been a good year to have ended the war, along lines of exhaustion. That courageous old nobleman, Lord Lansdowne, tried, but was shouted down as little better than a traitor. As civil war rages in the Balkans, and old animosities between Britain and Germany seem to be bursting forth anew, one realizes with alarm just what a frightening amount of hatred there is loose in today's world. Could a Verdun ever happen again? There were moments during the Cold War, perhaps some would conclude that October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, was one of them, when, for the West to survive, it had to show itself at least morally prepared to fight at Verdun. Of all the thousands of epitaphs written on the Battle of Verdun, the one that remains ever in my mind is that written by a Frenchman, Jean Dutour, deploring the moral debility of his countrymen in 1940. "War is less costly than servitude," he declared. "The choice is always between Verdun and Dachau." Perhaps it still is, but it would be hard to find a more terrible choice for the human race. Chapter 1. La débâcle. Car la revanche doit venir lente peut-être, mais en tout cas fatal et terrible à coup sûr la haine est déjà née, et la force va naître. C'est un faucheur à voir si le champ n'est pas mûr. Paul Déroulède. 3.5 years elapsed between the first battle of the Marne, when the Kaiser's armies reached the gates of Paris, and Ludendorff's last gasp offensive that so nearly succeeded in the spring of 1918. During this time, the Germans remained on the defensive behind a brilliantly prepared and almost impregnable line, while the French and British wasted themselves against it in vain, at an unimaginable cost in human lives. Only once did the Germans deviate from this strategy that paid so handsomely. In February 1916, they attacked in the Verdun sector, catching the French there thoroughly by surprise. Compared with the 7 German armies that marched into France in 1914 and Ludendorff's 63 divisions that struck at Hague in 1918, this assault on Verdun, with only 9 divisions, was but a small affair. A small affair. Yet out of it grew what those who took part in it considered to be the grimmest battle in all that grim war, perhaps in history itself. Certainly it was the longest battle of all time, and during the 10 months it lasted, nearly 3/4 of the French army were drawn through it. Though other battles of the First War exacted a higher toll, Verdun came to gain the unenviable reputation of being the battlefield with the highest density of dead per square yard that has probably ever been known. Above all, the battle was a watershed of prime importance in the First War. Before it, Germany still had a reasonable chance of winning the war. In the course of those 10 months, this chance dwindled away. Beyond it, neither the French nor the German army would be quite the same again. Verdun marked the point at which, among the Allies, the main burden of the war passed from France to Britain, and its influence upon America's eventual entry into the war cannot be overlooked. In the aftermath, too, Verdun was to become a sacred national legend, and universally a household word for fortitude, heroism, and suffering. But it was also a modern synonym for a Pyrrhic victory. Long after the actual war was over, the effects of this one battle lingered on in France. Of the men to arise from the triumph of Verdun, one in particular will be forever associated with the appalling tragedy of a generation later, and today the marks of Verdun upon France and the French have not been eradicated. Behind the scribbles of de Gaulle ne passera pas on Algerian walls lies perhaps more than just the adaptation of a famous battle cry. "This Western Front business couldn't be done again," declares Dick Diver in Tender is the Night. He was right, as 1940 proved. The nearest the Second World War came to it was at Stalingrad, often referred to as a Russian Verdun. The explanation of why there was no Western Front business in 1940, why the German panzers went rolling round the Maginot Line with such ease, why there was a Maginot Line at all, cannot be explained without reference to the happenings at Verdun in 1916. Similarly, to see how the German forces came to stand before Verdun in 1916, why they chose to attack what was reputedly the strongest fortress in Europe, and why the French withstood their attack with such incredible steadfastness, one needs to hark back to yet an earlier war, to the fateful year of 1870. 6 weeks after France had declared war that summer, the last emperor of the French, his face rouged to conceal the agonies caused by a monstrous bladder stone, was on his way to captivity in Germany. Within another 4.5 months, at Versailles, in the great palace that bears the inscription "À toutes les gloires de la France," and beneath a painting of Frenchmen chastising Germans, the Prussian king had himself proclaimed Kaiser. When at last the peace was signed, the conquerors insisted that its terms embrace a triumphal march through Paris, and only massed French citizens were able to prevent the Uhlans from perpetrating the ultimate insult of riding through the Arc de Triomphe. One would have to search diligently through the pages of history to find a more dramatic instance of what the Greeks called peripeteia, or reversal of fortune. Where before has a nation of such grandeur, indeed la grande nation, brimming over with hubris and refulgent with material achievement, been subjected to worse humiliation within so short a space of time? And when has a military power, as assured in traditions of soldierly prowess, been more shamefully defeated? In July 1870, Louis Napoleon's forces had set off, optimistically entitled the Army of the Rhine and lavishly equipped with maps of Germany, though none of France. After 2 minor defeats that were far from decisive, the French army never ceased retreating. Old crones along the route jeered at the dispirited, bedraggled soldiery. The vigilant Uhlans pursued them, now like a pack of wolves waiting for stragglers, now like beaters driving the frightened coveys towards the guns. Finally, half the army under Bazaine was herded into Metz, where it surrendered after doing nothing for 2 months. Into the trap at Sedan, just 40 miles downstream from Verdun, went the other half, under MacMahon, and accompanied by the Emperor himself. Nous sommes dans un pot de chambre, et nous y serons emmerdés, remarked General Ducrot. The words might have applied to the whole bitter sense of total disgrace felt by the French army after 1870. It was a terrible slur to be faced by the heirs of Henri IV and Condé, Turenne and Saxe, not to mention the great Bonaparte, by soldiers who, down through the ages, had considered themselves to be the warrior race of Europe. The results of Louis Napoleon's ill-advised declaration of war were to alter the character of war itself, as much as they were to affect the future of all Europe. The employment of mass conscript armies and the merciless sieges, where civilians had been indiscriminately blown to pieces by long-range guns, introduced a new savagery into warfare, which for some centuries had been a reasonably gentlemanly affair. The harsh Prussian peace terms, requiring the surrender of 2 of France's richest provinces and the payment of reparations on an unprecedented scale, so that the war would cost the loser nearly 10 times as much as the victors, instilled a new bitterness into European relations, and the French army would never forget its degradation. In 1871, France was exhausted, bankrupt, demoralized, the countryside ravaged and torn by civil war of the most brutal kind. France has frequently astonished the world by her recuperative ability, which stems from the intrinsic richness of a country twice as large as the British Isles, and her great resources of human energy, so often dissipated in the boudoir and the political lobby. Never, though, has her recovery been so rapid or so remarkable as after the catastrophe of 1870 to 1871. The legacy of the war was soon liquidated. A scapegoat to bear the collective disgrace of the army was speedily found in the form of Bazaine. Well ahead of schedule, the crushing £200 million of reparations were paid off, and in September 1873, the last Prussian soldiers left French soil. The French economy began to flourish as never before. The Paris Exposition of 1878 showed Europe that the affluence of the latter-day Second Empire was back again, though now a more solid achievement lay beneath the glittering surface. Nowhere was the Renaissance more striking than in the army. A new type of dedicated young officer, like Ferdinand Foch, who, as an 18-year-old student, had seen Louis Napoleon trail sick and defeated through Metz, strode forward to replace the fops of the Second Empire with their emulative imperials. A new spirit ran through the whole army, determined to expunge the recent blots on its reputation. With it went a passion for study, replacing the traditions of the café and the vacuous routine of garrison life. It formed a marked contrast to the days when MacMahon had threatened, "I shall remove from the promotion list any officer whose name I read on the cover of a book." Penetrating studies were made of the 1870 campaign, and in their sweeping reorganization, the army leaders made no bones about imitating the conqueror. 3 successive laws provided France for the first time with universal military service, of the exceptional length of 5 years, and a cadre of reserves. Under General Lual, a staff college was created to lay the foundations for something better than the inefficient old general staff disbanded by the Reformers, and later, under General Miribel, the État-Major de l'Armée was formed. In peace, its role was to prepare for war and, notably, to plan the details of mobilization in which France had been so deficient in 1870. In war, it was to provide the command of France's principal group of armies. Thus, in embryo, came to life the famous Grand Quartier Général, or GQG. In 1886, the French army adopted the first model of the Lebel rifle that it would go to war with in 1914. About the same time were laid down the calibers of guns that were used in the war, and a few years later high-explosive lyddite replaced black powder as a filling for shells. Of all the military reorganization undertaken by France after 1871, little concerns this story more than the defensive measures she carried out on her new frontier. By a chain of cause and effect, they were, moreover, to make inevitable Britain's participation in the First War, though this could hardly be foreseen at the time. The War of 1870 had been fought, on paper, more or less between equals, but now any thoughtful Frenchman could reasonably predict that disparity between the two nations would grow with increasing rapidity. The Germans were breeding faster, and with the transfer of Alsace-Lorraine, their industrial power was bound to expand more rapidly. However successful the reorganization of the French army, it alone could now hardly suffice to protect France against Germany. In addition, the redrawn frontier brought the hereditary enemy to less than 200 miles from Paris, with no natural barrier like the Rhine or the Vosges in between. Thus, a sapper general called Serret de Rivière was entrusted with the construction of a defensive system on a scale never before contemplated, and only to be outdone by Maginot. Instead of converting one or two cities into fortified camps, like Metz, which in 1870 had turned out to be an insidious trap, de Rivière built a continuous line of sunken forts, or rather two continuous lines. On the Swiss frontier, the system was anchored on Belfort and ran uninterruptedly along the line of hills to Épinal. At the old fortress town of Toul, on the Moselle, the line began again, along the heights on the right bank of the Meuse, to Verdun. North of Verdun was the dense Argonne, and then the Ardennes, through which, until von Manstein showed the way in 1940, it was assumed no invading army could maneuver. Between the linchpins of Toul and Épinal, de Rivière ingeniously left a 40-mile gap in the defences called the Trouée de Charme. It was like a gateway in a wall, intended, perhaps a little naively, to entice within and canalize any German invasion, so that the French mass of manoeuvre, lying in wait, could then conveniently drive into both its flanks and eventually close in behind. Of course, the Belgian frontier was left unfortified, save for a few scattered fortresses like Lille and Maubeuge. It was Verdun, with its vital position already fortified by Vauban, and indeed as far back as the Romans, that was both the principal strong point of and key to the whole system. 15 years after Sedan, the French army had regained both its defensive and offensive power to such an extent that it might well have triumphed in a fresh war with Germany, which, in the way of victors, had begun to rest on its laurels. Bismarck, reflecting anxiously on his own maxim, a generation that has taken a thrashing is always followed by one that deals out the thrashings, thought more than once of a preventive war. For although France's military dispositions were mainly defensive, occasionally she emitted sounds revealing that notions of revanche never lay very far beneath the surface. French officers' messes took symbolic joy in bowling over skittles, shaped like portly Prussian soldiers, while just across the frontier, German reservists at Metz sipped their beer out of steins covered with such fierce inscriptions as "Kanonen donner ist unser Gruß," and "He who on France's border stood guard has deserved, as a soldier, his reward." No cabaret or fête was complete without the appearance, greeted with wild enthusiasm, of an Alsatian girl in national costume. There was the fire-eating League of Patriots, formed by Déroulède, who had been at Sedan as a private in the Zouaves, and who was now dedicated to keeping alight the flame of revenge. Finally, there was the outburst of jingoism which found expression through General Boulanger. In 1886, the British ambassador wrote home caustically The Republic here has lasted 16 years, and that is about the time which it takes to make the French tired of a form of government. It was true, insofar as the leaders of the Troisième already stood in the customary repute of politicians in France. Suddenly, the emotions of Paris, and much of France, were ignited by the swashbuckling magnificence of the Minister of War, General Boulanger, who appeared mounted on a superb charger at the July 14th parade at Longchamp. Without inquiring too deeply where he might lead them, the masses made Boulanger their idol overnight. During the 9 days, Boulanger's wonder, inflammatory songs were heard in the street that seemed painfully evocative of the summer of 1870. Regardez-le là-bas, il nous souriait pas. Il vient de délivrer la Lorraine et l'Alsace. In Berlin, Bismarck's finger crooked round the trigger, but, fortunately for the peace of Europe, Boulanger soon committed suicide upon his mistress's grave, dying, in the words of Clemenceau's savage epitaph, as he had lived, like a subaltern. With the ridiculous Boulanger, much of the hard-earned esteem of the new French army also passed away. In 1889, a new act reduced military service from 5 to 3 years. Militarism cannot be sustained for long without promise of fulfilment, and there were some appealing distractions to mitigate the pain of the amputated territories. The great age of 19th-century expansion meant the prospect of colonial acquisitions, and France hastened to join in the rush. Cheered on from the sidelines by Bismarck as he murmured, "My map of Africa lies in Europe." As Algeria had made up for Waterloo, so Morocco and Tunisia, West Africa, Madagascar and Indochina helped make up for Alsace-Lorraine. By 1914, France ruled over nearly 4 million square miles abroad, with 50 million inhabitants, the second greatest colonial empire in the world. Admittedly, in the eyes of some soldiers, none of it was worth an acre of what was lost in 1871, but, for the time being, they were in the minority. As it was, a factor which Bismarck had certainly never calculated upon, France's empire made her a great deal richer and more powerful when war finally came, as well as providing her with an additional 500,000 excellent troops. Life in France was wonderfully good, too, during the 3 decades that spanned the century's turn. La vie douce could barely convey all it meant, though the Germans' envious expression of content as God in France perhaps came closer. Never had there been so much for so many. It was the epoch of the Eiffel Tower, of Degas and Renoir, Lautrec and Monet, of bistrots and the Moulin de la Galette, Maxims and de la Panagile, the Folies Bergère and the Palais de Glace, of Verlaine and Rimbaud, Zola and Sarah Bernhardt, Debussy and Ravel, and later Péguy and Apollinaire, of provocative Horizontale and Hôtel Particulier, of picnics and gay phaetons in the Bois, where the new trees were already growing up to replace those that had been felled for fuel during the siege. It was an epoch seething with ideas and creation. Every day there seemed to be something new. Inventions like electricity and the telephone were now yoked to man's service, and new medical discoveries to enable him to enjoy it all a little longer. The bicycle and le football introduced new pleasures. The Orient Express and Wagon-Lit brought new and wider worlds within range of Paris. Once again she assumed her eminence as the world's centre of culture and pleasure. It seemed impossible that the Commune had ever happened, and national pride was further inflated by Blériot's feat and a series of sporting triumphs. In the realm of economics, marvels were wrought, and almost overnight, it seemed, France became a great industrial power. Jointly with Britain, she was known as the banker of the universe. In every sense it was the epoch of enrichissez-vous, in which, for the first time, bourgeoisie, peasants, and even workers participated alike. Only the wine-growers, their vines stricken with deadly phylloxera, seemed to be left out. The newly powerful trades unions were seeing that a good part of the workers' demands were fulfilled, and who could complain when a carafe of wine cost you 30 centimes and you could buy a turkey for 7 francs? As in Adenauer's No Experiments Germany of today, material prosperity distracts minds from grieving unduly over the Ode de Nice, so in France, la vie douce was altogether too good for one to think sombre thoughts of arms and revenge. Then there was the Dreyfus affair, or simply the affair, which, for more than a decade...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?